I'm Scott Warner, president of the Culinary Historians of Chicago. And tonight we've got two world history experts when it comes to food, Victoria Flexner and Jay Reifel. They are food historians. Victoria and Jay have cooked up a New York supper club called Edible History, which is a pairing of fine dining and intellectual stimulation. And they've turned their experience into a recently published book by a very prestigious publisher, Rizzoli. The book is A History of the World in 10 Dinners, 2,000 Years. It's just recently released. It's got 100 recipes. One of the recipes, and we've sent you the link to it, is Glazed Horse Farts. And I think any book that has a recipe like that is worth looking at. But there's a lot more to whet your appetite, and they will talk about it. They're going to talk about, these two fabulous people have immense backgrounds. They're going to talk about their backgrounds and how they got together to dream up this very important culinary history literature book. So again, welcome Jay and Victoria, and let the show begin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much
to be here. Yeah, Jay and I started Edible History, which is our supper club that's based here in New York, in 2014. I'm a trained historian. I have a background of working in a number of museums here in the city. I worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the New York Public Library, as well as the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum. I also have a background in food PR. And around that time, I had this idea to kind of take my experience in the restaurant industry, along with my experience in the sort of world of history and public education, and to bring the two together. Jay is an incredibly talented chef and legend of the underground supper club scene here in New York. So the two of us kind of found each other through some sort of like chef food job listing sites here in the city. And immediately knew that we had something really special because we were both obsessed with all of the same old historic recipes and manuscripts. And we spent about 8 years bringing these dinners in New York to life. Each dinner was rooted in a very specific time period. All of the recipes or the dishes served at each dinner would be from period manuscripts. And then when the pandemic hit, we had a bit more time on our hands, and we worked on this book proposal, and really A History of the World in 10 Dinners. Our cookbook is a kind of like written version of what we were doing with our supper club for many years.
Yeah, precisely. We always joked that we do food as the gateway drug to history, but it's really, there's an incredible immediacy to cooking that almost no other medium really captures, in connecting people to the past and to other cultures. So it was kind of a perfect vehicle. And when Victoria and I met, it was just this perfect storm. It was like a meeting of the minds, and we had a very similar vision of what we wanted to achieve. And we did. So what would you like us to, where would you like us to start beyond the basic, genesis of the idea?
Well, the genesis of the idea is fine. I mean, what made you what is it that you're trying to convey with the book? How did it all come together, and what's the essence of the book? And I want to point out too, there are links to the recipes in the information we emailed to everybody and on our website for your program. But yeah, just what is it that you wanted to convey to the readers, or say you probably had to put in your book proposal, who's your target audience, or what is it that it's all about? It seems like quite an appetite filler, this book. It looks luscious. So yeah, tell us about some of the lusciousness. What is it that you wanted to convey?
Well, I think we were trying to tell not the history of the world, but rather one form of it, a history of the world. The time periods covered, it starts in ancient Rome, moves through 10th century Baghdad, medieval Silk Road, kind of through medieval Europe. We dart into the Americas. We come back to Africa. We do a little bit more of medieval Europe, and we end in 19th century New York. And really, we're trying to kind of connect some of these bigger threads that we've found studying food history over the last decade in our work together, which is really how foods and plants and animals have moved around the world through, ancient trade routes like the Silk Road, but then also the Columbian Exchange during the global medieval period. And really how all of our kind of culinary identities are a consequence of kind of interactions between different cultures. I'd say that that's a really big thread in this book, but also we're trying to just tell stories about human beings from these specific time periods. And, so many humans have been kind of left out of the historical narrative writ large, whether that is women or people of color. And so how do we access their stories and their voices if we don't have anything to study about their lives? And so food is a really wonderful way to do that. We often talk about using these ancient recipes as a way to sort of have a metaphysical experience with someone who lived a very, very long time ago. So we might not know what they thought or what they felt, but if we can experience something that they tasted, that they prepared, and that they consumed, that's a way to connect with the past in a kind of less traditional way.
Yeah, I think one of the most difficult and like one of the most fun things when we conceived of the construction of the book was what periods to focus on and also how to choose the dishes within that period. And it's actually more because there's an embarrassment of riches, particularly now. Like, we happen to live in a time of incredible information exposure. Trying to do this book even 20 years ago would have been vastly more difficult, vastly more expensive, and vastly not as good. Because we generally try to work exclusively from original documentation, we actually need to have some source document to work from. And given that I don't speak 12 or 13 languages, we were also incredibly lucky to work with a lot of translators. And just the fact that there are so many of these books easily accessible in really remarkable translations, and that is a group of people who are incredibly giving of their time. So it was actually, we had more, way more material to begin with than than you might expect. But what's tremendously interesting to me is the way Victoria and I work with each other back and forth to build a narrative for each chapter, because each chapter is a specific period in time and often a specific place. Well, that place might be, as she says, the medieval Silk Road. But how you break that down into a narrative and figure out what stories you're trying to tell, and then what dishes underline that and what ingredients underline that, is endlessly interesting and really a lot of fun.
And could you tell us some of these stories and anecdotes, like about the Roman period, the Tudor period, Moorish, Spanish? Yeah, can you? There must be some really juicy tales of this, savory with a lot of umami in
Absolutely. You want to do the black dinner?
Sure. Yeah. This is a dinner from ancient Rome that is featured in our book. I don't know if anyone has a copy, but there's a pretty wonderful picture of the dinner from hell that you'll have to check out for yourself if you haven't already. But essentially, so during the Roman Empire, I think it was about the 1st century, there was an Emperor Domitian, who was a bit mad, as a lot of the emperors of this period of Roman history were. And oh yeah, I think Jay, you might need to hold it back a bit.
I'm trying. I'm getting too much
too much
light on there. It's a very dark picture. Everything is black is the problem.
Nice. So yeah, the Emperor Domitian had this reputation for kind of knocking off anyone who displeased him. And so one night he invited a bunch of senators over to his home for dinner, and they were all quite nervous because usually being invited over to Domitian's house for dinner was not a good thing. And when they arrived in the dining room, the entire dining room was black. Funereal lights lit the room, and at each person's place setting was a tombstone with their name on it. And as each course came out of the kitchen, the food was dyed entirely black. And Domitian spent the entire evening kind of talking about the meaning of life and death, and everyone was sure that they were not going to make it out of this dinner alive. But then at the very end of dinner, Domitian let everyone take their own tombstone home as a party favor. So it famously became known as the dinner from hell. And in the book, it's kind of a black chicken, with lots of smoke. Yeah,
it's a silky chicken in the book, which is a naturally black flesh chicken. And all the food was dyed with not period dyes, because those were probably toxic, but was dyed black. We chose a couple dishes that we felt would be representative.
But Jay, well, you're an outstanding chef. Can you describe the taste of this? I'm sure you wouldn't have picked even the horse farts. I'm sure you wouldn't have picked them if they weren't tasty.
No, I mean that's one of the most interesting things that we do is, we do try to make dishes that are actually correct for the time. So then you must pick and choose ones that, do appeal to a modern palate. That is a dish of pumpkin stewed with chicken and truffles and peaches. And it's just lovely. I mean, it's very, very well balanced. And that's with a dish of Vero beets, which are beets that are attributed to a gourmet of the time named Vero. The funny side story from a culinary historical perspective of that is I was using a kind of standard Latin translation of Apicius when I did that. My Latin isn't terrible. And the recipe and translation actually listed one of the ingredients to cook the beets in as mead, and the Latin word is mulsum. And I originally cooked this with mead and then had this funny realization that wait, mead is strictly Northern European, and, Rome was a wine, culture. And then I did a little more digging and discovered that mulsum is honeyed wine, i.e. wine with an addition of honey, not wine made from honey, which actually completely changes the profile of the dish. So if nothing else, I corrected a Latin translation. So.
And would you say your recipes, I'm getting so hungry after listening to what sounded like, could be a food from hell. It's luscious sounding. And would you say that your recipes are for the home cook?
There is a very broad range within this cookbook. There are recipes that are totally for the home cook, and in fact, some of the most beloved ones are ones that are just a fairly straightforward dish. On the other hand, I used to say when people ask me what the heck is a historical chef, I say I'm the guy you call when you want to sew animals together, because I do a lot of things like that. So there are certain things, particularly say 19th century cold dishes, that are extremely difficult. They have a tremendous number of steps and are not, they're not for everyone.
Well, steps like sewing chicken inside a pork inside.
Yeah, probably my most iconic dish is this thing called the Cockatrice, which is one of the dishes you feature, which is a Tudor dish that represented a mythical animal that was very popular with Henry VIII. And what it is it's quite literally a capon, which is an emasculated rooster, half of it sewn to the other half of a suckling pig. So it's not one inside the other, it's the two actually sewn together and then stuffed with a filling made of pork and spices and candied fruits. And it's really quite lovely, but it's also spectacular and terrifying.
But it sounds like if you were invited to a dinner party like this, it's like not just some esoteric things. It sounds like it's delicious, and you could have a theme party and making an historical dinner and really have delicious food that's something people haven't eaten before. I mean, I'm getting, again, so hungry as I'm listening to you. It's terrible. Okay.
That is precisely what I hope people do with the book, you know?
Yeah, and really that's the wonderful thing about the book too, is that, you know, people can choose to just cook from one chapter, like one time period, you know, do a Versailles dinner with their friends, or, you know, something from 10th century Baghdad, or you can kind of choose your own adventure and maybe do an appetizer from one time period, a main from another, dessert from another. And the recipes in the book, it's sort of, there's historical text and kind of story from me, and then Jay's recipes, and then it goes back to sort of the history narrative again. And so the two really feed kind of back and forth off of one another. So if you were to cook some of these dishes at home, you also have some kind of history around the recipe,
right?
Help illuminate the time period. You know, you could even read it out loud or do a book club kind of thing with your fellow intrepid historical diners. Yeah,
please do.
I worked for this very famous chef in Chicago who did historical dinners, probably making them the way that people actually made them. Louis Zathmary, he donated all his historical books to the library at Johnson and Wales. It was supposed to be the largest cookbook collection of its kind, maybe in the world. But he would really do probably tasty, but esoteric stuff. But again, yours sounds like something that, again, people can they eat their history and enjoy it too, and you don't have to be a world-renowned chef to put it together. So it sounds so intriguing, and of course you're reading what's in the chapters, and you're learning about history too, and savoring it. Anyway, I'm rhapsodizing here. Please keep talking.
Yeah, I think another chapter that was really fun for us to put together was Renaissance Italy. Just because, you know, Renaissance Italy is obviously a historical time period that most people in the Western world are very familiar with, have probably studied even just a little bit, maybe in high school. You know, we know a lot about the Renaissance. And so Jay and I were really trying to figure out, you know, what kind of story can we tell about the Renaissance that people aren't already very familiar with. And so in my research, I came across Lucrezia Borgia, who was the daughter of Pope Alexander VI, and, you know, an heiress to the Borgia kind of family. And she had quite an incredible life. Obviously, she was the daughter of a pope, which seems like that maybe shouldn't be a thing. But Pope Alexander VI actually had a number of children, and really we should see him as a king. You know, his children were his heirs, and he had, you know, a dynasty. But what was really fun about that chapter was that because a lot of the dishes that Jay includes recipes for are kind of elite dishes, there's a number of ones in there that we can, you know, be sure Lucrezia ate some kind of a version of. And so it was wonderful to be able to sort of dive into her biography and really tell her story as this sort of misunderstood woman of the medieval period. She's often portrayed as, you know, kind of villainous and, you know, up to no good like the rest of her male family members, when I think in actuality she was probably a bit of a victim who was kind of pawned off by her father and then her brother and all these different sort of strategic marriages, but then becomes quite a powerful figure in her own right. When her father, the Pope, tours the papal states, he leaves her in charge of the papacy at home, and she is in his office going through his correspondence, making huge decisions for Rome. And a nice kind of bit of that book ends with one of Jay's lovely recipes for a Florentine braised stew. And there's another incredible recipe for ravioli in a meat broth, right?
Yeah.
And so we can sort of begin to imagine, as we're reading about Lucrezia's story, her eating some of these dishes and really get like quite a deep sense of this woman who lived, 600-700 years ago.
Yeah, and from a culinary standpoint, I think one of the most interesting things about that chapter is it's more clearly a turning point than maybe some of the others. Like if you look at the Tudor chapter, you don't necessarily see an immediate through line to like modern English food, apart from like, oh, there are roasts, etc. But there you actually see a lot of, early examples of dishes that we are starting to recognize as modern Italian food. It's also the same as the Ethiopian chapter. I think the other thing, I think for food history nerds, is that's one of the chapters where you start to see, the evidence before what we call the Great Circulation, which is the exchange of foodstuffs, from the quote unquote old world to the new, stuff that came from the Americas. Because obviously you're looking at Italian food without tomatoes, for example, and but to me the counter side to that is like, that seems to be like the low-hanging fruit that everybody knows, like Italian food without tomatoes, and Irish and German food without potatoes. I think it's very easy to forget that the flip side of that is Mexican food without lime juice or citrus, which is actually kind of a mind blower when you think about it. So
absolutely. Or a lot of Asian cuisines without chilies. Chilies are from the Americas and didn't exist anywhere on the Asian continent until the Portuguese introduced them to Goa in 1527. So to try and imagine a lot of food of Southeast Asia and parts of China without chilies it's quite mind-boggling.
yeah.
Let's get back to all this fascinating history and food, and but Jessica Harris wrote the foreword, and I mean, she is so renowned in the food world.
Absolutely. Can
you tell us a little bit about her and how she happened to write the foreword to your book? I mean, that's a major coup to get her to write your foreword, but please tell our audience a bit about her if they don't already know.
Well, we cold emailed her as just huge fans of her work. I mean, she really is such an icon of American food history. She wrote the incredible book High on the Hog, which was also turned into a Netflix series that tells the story of the journey of foods from Africa to America, particularly through the lens and experience of Black Americans. And we just sent her an email telling her how much we, appreciated her work and admired her work. And she said that she was quite busy, but that she'd be happy to write a blurb. And we sent her a copy of the book. And then she emailed back about a week or two later and said, I've just read the book. It's wonderful. If you still want a forward, I would love to write it.
Wow.
So then she ended up making some time for us in her schedule. And we just feel very honored to have Dr. Harris give a nodding approval to the work that we're doing. Certainly helped quell some anxieties before the book came out. Like, are we on the right track with this thing? Are we? So yeah, we're very honored to have her name be a part of this project for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, and she is certainly not chapped liver, so if she gave her blessings, so well, how I'm not asking you to blow your own horn, but do you feel that this book seems to me different than any historical book? It would just be recipes in the history. Yours kicks it up a notch, I think. Again, what's your concept for this? If I'm asking the right question, it just seems like something that is a little beyond any historical recipe book or cookbook that I've seen, or is it? Or
I think I understand what you're saying, Scott. I mean, a lot of the books that exist out they're wonderful books, are perhaps a bit more recipe oriented or narrative oriented. And, you know, the plus side of Jay and I working together is that, you know, we were both able to work incredibly hard on our kind of individual aspects of this project. I mean, and a lot of maybe the other books you're referring to are just one author. So that would be quite an undertaking for one individual. But, you know, Jay was, you know, able to bring 100 recipes to life from over 2,000 years of history. And then because he was, you know, focusing on that aspect, I was able to focus on the narrative aspect. And so maybe that's what makes it feel like it's been like kicked up a notch, is that in some ways it's sort of two books in one. But I mean, they're really, you know, they support.
Like, honestly, like, I don't think there's another book that has the scope, maybe the hubris to attempt, you know, really big swaths of history. There's, you know, many historical food books, because I read tons of them, that almost exclusively focus on a specific ingredient or a specific period in history or a specific thing, like sweets throughout history or the Tudor period, but no one has really tried to do something this broad. And I think the huge advantage of undertaking such a large project is it allows us to explore these trends and commonalities that follow throughout history. So many things about, you know, the actual movement of peoples and foods. You just don't get to do that if you're focusing on, you know, medieval France or whatever, you know.
And you kind of focused it on a digestible, intellectually digestible 10 dinners. It's not just a random or just a whole bunch of recipes and a whole bunch of history. It's focused on certain areas like Spain or periods, and it's focused through the eyes of 10 dinners. So I did want to, I'm jumping around here, but you're one of the things, and I don't mean this to be too funny, but it's intriguing, the horse farts. I mean, my God, how can anybody, but that's from England, you know, you always think.
That's from Versailles, France.
I'm sorry, Versailles. Well,
yeah. And also not to be confused with donkey's farts or nuns' farts, which were other pastries of the era. And these are actually mostly, they're all meringues that are various, you know, sizes and flavorings, but, you know, good name. I'm so happy I got it in book, because I'm
there was no way that wasn't going in the book.
But when I looked at the recipe, it looks simple and delicious. And and can you tell what that nasty sounding thing really is?
Oh, it's basically just a meringue that is flavored with orange blossom water. I mean, you could also use rose water, use whatever, you know, whatever alchemically derived flavoring you like.
But historically, I mean, it's kind of, what's the word, raveled?
Yeah, absolutely.
How does that fit in with the culture, you know, from Versailles to, you know, elegant Versailles?
Well, I think they had a sense of humor. It comes from La Varennes, you know, like the Pâtissier Français, which is his sequel to the Cuisinier Français, which I'm probably mispronouncing because my French is atrocious. One is 1651, and the second one is 1653. But it's, you know, they had a sense of humor. Maybe it wasn't considered as ribald like the way we might consider, you know, the passing of gas. I mean, one of the two most famous farters in history, Roland the Farter, who was a famous court jester, also in France, I think of the next century, no, earlier, right?
I want to say
but also the other most famous farter in history is Le Pétomètre from, you know, turn of the century, you know, whatever. Follies, you know. He was, you know, an entertainer in Paris in the early part of the 20th century, who famously farted.
It sounds like his act was a real gas, huh?
Indeed.
But anyway, please do continue with any other. Oh, there's tons of stories. You have more about the history and anecdotes.
Let me actually complete a thought that I was,
Yes.
going back to Tudor and Horn for a moment. But when I talk about, what Victoria and I are doing as addressing a much, broader scope, one of the things when you're looking at 2,000 years of history is I happen to be obsessed with like the global spice trade and the way that transformed the world. And which is something that had different periods and, moved, has thousands of years of history, but it is easy to forget that something like, black pepper was an engine of world history. Commercial corporations were created for black pepper. Commercial insurance was partially created for black pepper. Rome at one point was ransomed for black pepper, all in different periods. So it allows us to consider these things that you might not think about, that the Portuguese exploration and Henry the Navigator going around Africa for the first time to reach India was in pursuit of spices. All these things end up being connected, like in ways that I actually find very beautiful.
And one of your chapters covers New York City, 19th century. That's hitting close to home. Can you talk about some of the food history that you cover in your book from New York City?
Well, the New York City chapter,
Where
which
you
is
are right now,
where we both are right now, is the final chapter in the book. Jay and I don't like to cover any period of history that someone is alive from, because then you're competing with nostalgia. So the 19th century felt like a good place to kind of cut ourselves off. But also it follows the Versailles chapter, and at the sort of beginning of the French Revolution and during the French Revolution, as the Versailles chapter is concluding, a lot of French chefs began to immigrate to America. Because they found themselves out of work, as their employers were either losing their heads or going into hiding. And a lot of those chefs who came to New York actually started some of the very first restaurants, as we think of the concept today, in New York City. And so that chapter is really about the New York City restaurant. We talk a lot about Delmonico's, but another of other kind of like Gilded Age restaurants, and it's sort of looking at the evolution of fine dining on American soil. And I think some of the dishes that Jay was mentioning at the beginning, where it's like, I'll let you take it away with the cold dishes, because they're totally insane. But it's American haute cuisine, which makes sense because it was literally coming from the haute cuisine of France, from like the finest chefs, but being reborn on American soil in a totally new way, that was very much kind of dynamic with the evolution of New York City itself.
Just want to interject, excuse me, our speaker last month was Max Tucci.
Oh, yeah, the Delmonico's way. Yeah, we know Max. Yeah.
He's wonderful. And I know that was America's first fine dining restaurant, the restaurant that introduced white tablecloths and all sorts of things. But anyway, I thought that was interesting that you were mentioning Delmonico's. So
yeah, I know we're familiar with Max. Yeah.
So
well, I mean, the cookbook that came out of Delmonico's, which is The Epicurean by Charles Ranhofer, which I think is 1874, is the edition I use, at least. There's a couple editions, is like the most insane. It's one of the 2 or 3 greatest cookbooks in history. It's in 2 volumes. Each is like 1,000 pages. It's got an obscene amount of recipes, or you could say an absurd amount of recipes. It's incredibly illustrated. I think it was self-published by him, but it's just an incredible tome that everyone should look at. But that chapter is kind of divided into 2 parts. Like the first half of the chapter is much more like pub food and simpler fare that you might get, and then it builds to this crescendo of these like extremely like difficult and fancy. There's a lot of truffles and what have you. Probably certainly the most complex recipe in the book is a dish from that. And you have to understand that in this period, the kind of test piece for chefs was these elaborate cold dishes. So these are ballotines of quail a la Madison. And what these were is you're basically boning out a quail or a squab, you can do either one, filling it with a truffled force meat around some pieces of foie gras and ham. And you're cooking this in a, semi-spherical mold in an oven. You take it out of the oven, you compress it under a weight till it cools, you take it out of the mold. You fill the mold with chaud-froid sauce, which is like a white, it's kind of like gelatin stabilized bechamel. And you put it back in the mold. And you chill it and you take it out of the mold. And now you decorate the inside of the mold with an elaborately cut truffle and you fill it with aspic and you put it back in the mold and you take it out of the mold. And you do this 12 times, of course, and you never get these hours of your life back. And actually, that's really less than half of the recipe, because then it goes on and gives you these instructions to carve, first of all, a stand with arms to hold all these little ballotines on. And then it gives you instructions on how to take wax and fat and carve griffins holding scallop shells to hold the stand that you already made. And then you decorated it with more truffles and pieces of cut aspic and stuffed coxcombs. And it goes on for like a page. Full disclosure, I've never done that half of it, but someday I shall.
It sounds like, I think, something like fancy Renaissance cooking from the courts, or...
It has a long tradition of that. In fact, one of the, I joke that you should always have an aspirational recipe, like the thing that you want to get to someday. And one that's out of that book that I haven't made is this thing that's just called Bastion Americain, like the American castle. And again, you're making a bunch of galantines of duck and you're putting them in this mold of a castle that you fill with aspic. And you take it out and you decorate it with aspic battlements and a sugar cupula on top. And then there's just a picture of a castle in the book. Like, that's what it's going to look like. I'm working on it.
How fascinating. You know what, Kathy, is there anything either of you want to add right now before we go to chat questions, or dying to tell everybody?
Yeah, happy to do some questions. Yeah.
Great.
Judith Hines asked, what was the most surprising thing, fact, recipe from all of the research which you could include in the book? That's almost like you answered it just a moment ago, but then again, maybe you have more.
So many.
Yeah, there's so many. Yeah.
Most surprising.
Most surprising.
I'll give an example of something.
Yeah.
One of the most surprising things, and it's actually, I would say, technically one of the most difficult recipes in the book, and certainly technically one of the most difficult recipes to perfect. And I'm pretty sure I nailed it, and that's saying something, which is for injera, which is the flatbread in the Ethiopia chapter. And there's basically two ways. There's only one way to learn to make injera, and that's grow up as an Ethiopian woman. And I say woman because it's 99% made by Ethiopian women who learn from their mothers and grandmothers, and you watch it over and over and over. It is a multi-stage fermentation that makes a very, very thin matter that is then poured on a hot plancha and then covered about halfway through. So it cooks like a crepe and then steams, and it makes this, I'm sure many of you have had it, this slightly sour, springy, spongy, ephemeral, incredible bread that functions both as a serving plate and, and utensils. And it's just, it cannot be separated from Ethiopian cuisine, but it is extremely difficult to get right. Even just pouring it in a perfect spiral and covering it for exactly the right amount of time and revealing it and having it come out right is hard. But you have to have such a sense for the process of fermentation and the very specific textures and stuff. And through a lot of trial and error and a lot of research, I did come up with a way that did it, but I was a little bit surprised how like fiendishly difficult that one can be.
Because I know it's a very specific flour.
Yeah, it's teff flour.
And it's also a yeast.
Yeah, and the funny thing about teff flour is teff flour has extremely little protein in it, which is, if I'm going to get really technical, is why there is a step of boiling a small amount and recombining it, because you're basically pre-gelatinizing the starch in the batter, the same way Wondra flour would do with, like, you know, wheat flour.
Oh, that's interesting, because when you say there's very little protein, that means there's very little gluten.
There's, yes.
And yet when you see injera, it's full of bubbles.
Yeah.
It's full of bubbles, and those bubbles are within a starch matrix much more. There's, you know, even the protein that's in teff doesn't really make gluten the way wheat protein was, the same way like rice protein doesn't make gluten the way, you know,
wow,
wheat does.
Because I know I've known people who've been trying to make it, and now you're explaining there's some other issues that, because we thought it was all yeast driven, not so much from what you just described.
It's yeast raised. So like the carbon dioxide is from yeast, but the reason it tends to not work has nothing to do with that. It's that it's very hard to get the right amount of hydration. By the book. That's all I'm saying. Check out the recipe. It's a little bit complex, but
I have to do that.
But yeah, it does. It's all about controlling the hydration of the starch granules, and there's kind of a multi-stage process to make that work. But it does work.
Okay, but you're looking at all of these rather elderly, you know, there's older concepts. For instance, you know, like butter the size of a walnut or butter the size of an egg.
Right.
What egg are we talking about? So how did you work out those kinds of details when you're trying to reverse engineer?
So yeah, I mean, this is one of the hardest things about converting these recipes to modern recipes, and it really depends on the period, because if you're looking at like medieval Europe, which I've done a lot of, you're lucky if you get butter the size of a walnut. You just take this and this and this and cook it and serve it forth. And if there's a weight and a measure, it might be a pound, or it might be like half a bullock. Or my personal favorites are add vinegar and put it back in the oven for 4 Our Fathers, because, you know, everyone was Catholic. Okay. Put it back in the oven for the time it takes a man to walk around a field. I don't know what field, I don't know what man. So there's a lot of trial and error with that. On the other hand, you might get a cookbook like Annals of the Caliph's Kitchen from 10th century Baghdad, which is more than Ranhofer, the most incredible cookbook in the history of civilization, which is this incredible tome that was written over 1,000 years ago, and 500 years before those same European cookbooks are still take this and this and this and cook it and serve it forth. There's this incredible cookbook that has weights and measures and has explanations and is divided into sections and talks about cleanliness and talks about, you know, the different parts of a kitchen and like everything you would expect in a modern cookbook, except it's also filled with poetry and stories, and it's earth-shattering. I can't tell you. Buy it.
And is that book referenced in your book?
Yeah, all the recipes from our 10th century Baghdad chapter are based on that. An incredible translation by Nawal Nasrallah. Shout out to her. She's amazing.
It's called Annals of the Caliph's Kitchen, but also in the back of our book, we have a full bibliography, all the sources from every single time period that we consulted.
Yes, of course I do, because I also find myself in the position of reversing these recipes. You know, they're more modern in the sense that it's more like 19th century, but still there's just things that just don't. Oh, there's a new message now. Were there any recognized food historians that you consulted for your research?
I mean, quite a few food historians were consulted. especially Jay, because of the language barrier with certain ancient languages. But I also reached out to Ken Albala just to ask him when we started working on the first chapter if he kind of thought we were on the right track with things, and he took a look at it and said, yeah, keep going. So yeah, so we got, we consulted quite a few different people along the way, but mainly in their kind of respective fields.
Yeah, also food scientists for certain things that, I would, in terms of trying to recreate one of the most iconic fermented products of a different period, I had to consult with food scientists to kind of speculate on what that thing would be like so I could create some kind of simulacrum of it. But historians and translators, and again, I have to thank those people, and I'm always blown away by how helpful people who work in those kind of academic spaces are giving of their time.
Yeah.
Because if they don't share, they'll need that feedback from somebody else at some point. So it's really good to be kind of sharing. I heard this recently, and I probably shouldn't bring it up, but they were talking about the Lewis and Clark exposition, or their expedition, and they've been able to figure out where they were because they ingested mercury, and mercury, may leave your system, but it doesn't go away. And so they've been able to find where they use the facilities.
Right.
Because of the presence of the mercury. It's like wild stuff. So, and that's the thing with some of these older recipes, there's chemicals in there that you really shouldn't be ingesting.
Like lead, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Or mercury. Yeah. This was fun.
Well, I had another question here. Get my money's worth out for the time.
Please.
And our speakers, everybody, donate their time. We do not pay speakers, so they're doing this out of love and to share what they have to offer us. But one of the questions I asked was about some anecdotes about your last chapter, New York City, 19th century. Do you have anything to close with about your first chapter, Ancient Rome, where, well, a lot of things began? Any fascinating things about the food, or you just name it, history, or
There's a bunch of fun stuff from Ancient Rome. We actually start the book with there's a couple nods both to history and literature in that chapter. We start the book with a spiced and honeyed wine with a pearl dissolved in it, referencing the famous story of Antony and Cleopatra, where supposedly they bet each other that each one could have a banquet that cost more than the other, and Antony went first and he put on this spectacular banquet, et cetera, did not kill anyone. And then she put on an equally spectacular banquet, and at the culmination of it, raised a glass of vinegar in which she had dissolved a pearl that was extremely valuable, thereby winning the bet. So we kind of started with that as kind of a, set the tone of something smart but funny.
Yeah, I think, as much serious history as we cover, and certainly there's a lot of it over 2,000 years, Jay and I also like to kind of recognize the humor in a lot of situations, and kind of, give a lightness to things, as well, as you can see with the horse farts and the dinner from hell. So, there's some serious moments, but yeah, also some humorous ones as well.
Well, I want to thank you both with a little anecdote how I got involved with the culinary historians, and it relates to what you just did tonight. Years ago, Madeline Bullwinkle, who's on this, she's taught art history at the University of Illinois, and she was voted one of the top cooking teachers in Chicago, typical food background. But she called me years ago and said, we're starting this new group, the Culinary Historians of Chicago, and why don't you come into the planning meetings? And I said to her, culinary historians, I said, I don't think I'd fit in. It sounds too academic. Well, here I am now president of the group, and I'm still not academic. And I want to thank you, academic as in AKA boring. So what you've done tonight. You've done a perfect culinary historians program, and it was certainly not boring. Thank you so much, and great luck. And I will see you hopefully next year in New York at the IACP awards ceremony, because I think you got a winner there. So
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you
Thank
so much for having us. This was really lovely.
thank you. Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.